So today is March 28th, and exactly 47 years ago today, in 1979, the United States experienced its absolute worst commercial nuclear accident.
Right, at 3 Mile Island.
Exactly.
Right.
But if you're tuning in thinking we're just doing some standard retrospective history lesson about a melted reactor, let me just stop you right there.
Yeah, that is not what we're doing today.
Not at all. We are taking the, profound systemic failures of this 47-year-old event, and we're using them as a critical metaphor for the age we are stepping into right now.
The age of artificial intelligence.
And specifically, the looming rise of artificial general intelligence, or AGI. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way.
It really is the ultimate technological metaphor, but I think we need to set the tone right away. We have to clarify what this deep dive is not about.
Oh, absolutely.
But we are not here to, discredit nuclear energy, because when you actually look at the hard data from our sources, nuclear energy is statistically one of the safest energy sources on the planet.
It is. And we'll get into those numbers later, but they are mind-blowing.
Right. And to just put a pin in it early, the accident in Pennsylvania in 1979 claimed 0 documented human lives.
0. Nobody died.
Nobody was crushed. Nobody was, provably poisoned by radiation. But that single event completely shattered society's innocence.
Yeah, it really destroyed the public's trust in these hyper-complex systems, right? And the whole technocratic elite who run them.
Exactly. And that concept of lost innocence, that's what makes this so incredibly relevant for you, the listener, today.
Because we are going to guide you through the exact anatomy of that 1979 disaster, minute by minute. We have to understand how the machine actually failed.
Then we're going to look at the psychology of risk, like why humans are so irrational about what scares us.
Right. And finally, we're taking all of those lessons and mapping them directly onto the black box algorithms and AGI systems that are being built right now.
Because the exact same human blind spots that melted a reactor core in the 70s are currently being coded into the modern global economy.
It's wild to think about. But to really grasp this AGI metaphor, we need to start by demystifying the reactor itself.
Yeah, we have to move away from the Hollywood idea of a nuclear accident. We need to get into the granular mechanical cascade that doomed this specific facility.
So let's set the scene. It's 4:00 a.m. on March 28, 1979. We are about 16 kilometers southeast of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
On a literal island in the Susquehanna River, 3 Mile Island.
Right, operated by Metropolitan Edison. Now, they have 2 massive pressurized water reactors there. Unit 1 had been running safely for years.
Since 1974, yeah.
But Unit 2, TMI-2, is basically brand new. It just started commercial operation in December 1978.
So it's been online for a mere 3 months, barely broken in.
Barely. And when things go wrong at 4 in the morning, it doesn't start with some massive explosion. There's no villain sneaking in to sabotage anything.
No, it starts with the most mundane, boring, industrial hiccup you can imagine.
It was a maintenance issue, right? On a plumbing system.
Exactly. A minor mechanical failure in the secondary cooling loop.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. A pressurized water reactor basically has 2 main loops of water.
Right, the primary and the secondary.
Yeah, so the primary loop runs this super hot, highly pressurized water directly through the radioactive nuclear core.
And then you have the secondary loop, which takes that heat, turns its own water into steam, and spins the turbines to make electricity.
So at 4:00 a.m., the main feed water pumps in that secondary loop just fail. They stop sending water.
And here's the thing that really stood out in the source material. When those pumps failed, the nuclear safety systems actually work flawlessly.
Wait, really? They worked?
They did exactly what they were engineered to do. The moment the secondary pumps failed, the system recognized a loss of heat transfer.
Okay, so the turbine automatically trips, meaning it shuts down.
Yes. And the reactor itself automatically performs what is called a scram.
A scram. That's when the control rods drop into the core, right?
Exactly. In a fraction of a second, these rods drop down, they absorb the neutrons, and they instantly halt the nuclear fission chain reaction. Fission stopped.
So the reactor is technically off. The atomic reaction is dead.
Right.
See, I used to think that meant the danger was completely over. You hit the off switch, the machine powers down, and you just figure out the plumbing issue in the morning.
And that is a totally intuitive human assumption. But it completely ignores the brutal reality of nuclear physics.
Because of the decay heat.
Exactly. Shutting down the fission reaction does not instantly make the reactor cold. The radioactive byproducts inside those fuel rods are still intensely hot.
Our sources say they were generating about 6% of the reactor's normal heat output.
Right, and 6% doesn't sound like much on paper.
But in a machine designed to power a city, that is a massive concentrated amount of thermal energy.
Oh, it's huge. That decay heat absolutely must be continuously cooled by circulating water, or the fuel rods will literally melt themselves into radioactive slag.
Okay, so the secondary loop isn't taking the heat away anymore. So the temperature and the pressure inside the primary loop, the water actually touching the core, starts to spike.
The system is getting squeezed.
But again, the engineers anticipated this. At the very top of the pressurizer, there is a specific valve.
The pilot-operated relief valve, or PORV.
Right, the PORV. It automatically opens to vent that excess pressure into a tank.
Think of it like a pressure cooker on your stove letting off a little burst of steam so the pot doesn't explode.
Exactly. And once the pressure drops back down to a safe, normal level, that valve is supposed to automatically spring shut.
Only it didn't spring shut.
It physically jammed. The valve stuck open.
And this mechanical failure brings us to the critical turning point of the entire event.
This is where it gets crazy.
It introduces what is arguably the most fatal user interface flaw in modern industrial history.
Yes, let's talk about the operators, guys like Craig Faust and Ed Frederick. They are standing in this control room.
Right, looking at massive panels covered in dials, switches, and lights.
And there is one specific indicator, light, designed to tell them the status of that relief valve.
When the system sends the command to open the valve, the light goes on. When the system sends the command to close it, the light goes out.
So the pressure drops, the system sends the close command, and the light on the panel goes dark.
Which the operators are heavily trained to interpret as, the valve is successfully closed, the system is sealed.
But the light was answering a completely different question than the one the operators thought they were asking.
Yeah, and we really need to dig into the engineering logic of 1979 here.
Please, because it explains so much about how we build systems. Why would a light tell them the valve is closed when it's actively blowing superheated steam?
It comes down to how it was wired. You see, putting a highly sensitive physical sensor inside a pipe filled with radioactive 600-degree pressurized steam is mechanically difficult.
And incredibly prone to failure, I imagine.
Exactly. So the engineers who built the panel made a choice optimized for cost and simplicity.
They didn't wire the indicator light to a sensor on the actual physical valve stem.
No. They wired the light to the electrical solenoid, the switch, that merely commanded the valve to close.
Oh, wow. So when the electrical current to the solenoid stopped, the light just went out.
Right. It indicated that the order to close had been issued. It did not in any way verify that the mechanical valve had actually obeyed the order.
Think about how wild that is for the operators. I always try to relate this to everyday technology because we deal with lying interfaces all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Just with lower stakes.
Right. It is exactly like emptying the trash on your computer desktop.
That's a great analogy from the sources.
You drag a huge folder of sensitive files to the trash icon. You click empty trash. The computer plays that little crumpling paper sound.
The icon changes to an empty bin.
Exactly. And you implicitly trust that those files are permanently gone from your hard drive.
But imagine a software glitch where behind the scenes, your hard drive is ignoring the command.
It's actually duplicating those files over and over, silently eating up your memory, while the user interface sits there displaying an empty trash can.
The interface told you the command was executed. It completely lied about the physical reality of the hard drive.
And that analogy captures the exact cognitive trap those operators were in.
Because of that dark indicator light, they firmly, 100% believe the valve is closed.
But in physical reality, the cooling water inside the reactor's primary loop is continuously boiling off and escaping as steam through this stuck-open valve.
They are actively experiencing a loss of coolant accident, a OCA.
OCA. But their mental model of the system, dictated by the user interface, tells them everything is perfectly sealed.
And this is where we really have to talk about the human element, the operators themselves.
Yeah, because whenever a massive industrial disaster happens, the natural, immediate instinct of the public is to blame the people at the controls.
People always say, how could you be so stupid? You were standing right there.
Right. But they weren't sitting in a quiet room making leisurely philosophical decisions.
Not at all. They were dealing with an environment that was actively working against human cognition. The control room was in a state of sensory assault.
We are talking about hundreds of different alarms blaring simultaneously, right?
Hundreds. There is a psychological phenomenon called alarm fatigue. The sheer volume of auditory and visual warnings just becomes white noise.
It makes it impossible to prioritize the real threat.
And it gets worse. Important warning lights on the panel were actually physically covered up by maintenance tags hanging off other switches.
Oh my God. Just an ergonomic nightmare.
Completely. And in the midst of this overwhelming chaos, the operators made a decision that, when you read about it in hindsight, seems completely insane.
But in the moment, it was perfectly rational. Let's walk through that rational mistake because it's the core of the whole tragedy.
Okay, so because that valve is stuck open and water is boiling away, steam voids, literally giant bubbles, are forming down in the cooling system.
And those massive steam bubbles are physically pushing the remaining liquid water up into the pressurizer tank.
So the operators look at their pressurizer level indicator and they see the water level rising rapidly.
Now remember their training. These men were drilled over and over again on one specific terrifying scenario.
Never let the pressurizer go solid.
Right. Going solid means letting that tank fill completely to the top with liquid water.
Because if it fills entirely with water, you lose the steam cushion, you lose the ability to control pressure.
And the rigid metal pipes of the reactor could literally rupture, causing a catastrophic failure.
So their eyes are glued to this rising water level. But because the interface is telling them the relief valve is closed, they can't figure out why the water is rising.
They conclude, logically based on the lying interface, that the system simply has too much water in it.
So they take action based on that logical but entirely false premise. High-pressure emergency induction pumps had automatically turned on to flood the core with cooling water.
And the operators manually override the system.
They manually reduce the flow of life-saving emergency cooling water.
They are intentionally starving a reactor that is, in reality, boiling dry.
It is the tragic definition of a rational error. They aren't cowboys. They aren't trying to cut corners.
No, they're diligently following their training. But the system's presentation of reality was a total fiction.
It took over 2 hours for a different shift supervisor, arriving later, to look at the temperature readings in the tailpipe and deduce that the valve must be stuck open.
2 hours. And he manually closed a backup block valve, finally sealing the leak.
But 2 hours without adequate cooling is an eternity in nuclear physics. The damage was already catastrophic.
Without the water to cool them, the zirconium cladding on the uranium fuel rods became so hot it reacted chemically with the steam,
which created a massive, extremely dangerous hydrogen bubble inside the reactor.
The temperature skyrocketed to thousands of degrees, and the uranium fuel itself began to melt.
Roughly 52% of the entire reactor core melted down into a heap of highly radioactive slag at the bottom of the vessel.
52%. Half of the nuclear core destroyed. $1 billion piece of infrastructure ruined, an entire region sent into a panic.
And the initial domino that started the cascade wasn't an earthquake or a bomb.
It was a light bulb. A light bulb that told a human being a valve was closed when it was actually open.
Which forces us to ask a really difficult question about accountability. Can you genuinely blame a human being for making a rational choice based on a system that is fundamentally lying to them?
And that question leads us directly into the immediate aftermath of the accident. How does society even process a disaster of this scale?
Well, when you have an event that displaces tens of thousands of people, that terrifies an entire nation with the threat of an invisible radioactive cloud, society demands a villain.
We really do. Human beings have a deep evolutionary psychological need to find a scapegoat.
We want to point a finger at a specific person of flesh and blood and say, you did this to us, you're the reason we are afraid.
We want a simple narrative. We want the greedy corporate CEO who cut safety corners, or we want the lazy, negligent worker who fell asleep at the switch.
We absolutely do not want to hear that a complex socio-technical system suffered an emergent failure. That is not satisfying.
Not at all. And initially, the operating company, Metropolitan Edison, gave the public exactly the simple narrative they craved. They were very quick to label the entire event as operator error.
It's the ultimate corporate defense mechanism, isn't it? Blame the guys on the floor so nobody questions the fundamental technology.
Right, or the design of the control room or the management structure that put them there.
Precisely. But that convenient narrative began to collapse almost immediately under independent scrutiny.
Because President Jimmy Carter, recognizing the absolute collapse of public trust, appointed an independent presidential commission to investigate.
The Kemeny Commission.
Named after its chairman, John Kemeny, who was a brilliant mathematician and the president of Dartmouth College.
And Kemeny approached this not just as an engineering problem, but as a systems problem.
And when that commission released their final report, it was an absolute watershed moment in the history of industrial safety.
Because they essentially exonerated the operators. They cleared them of malicious intent, and they cleared them of sheer incompetence.
The commission looked at the evidence and concluded that the operators were victims of the system, not the perpetrators of the disaster.
They indicted the entire ecosystem of nuclear power generation. They pointed the finger at a nightmare of bad ergonomics.
They pointed at poor training protocols that entirely failed to cover edge cases or multiple compounding failures.
And most importantly, they pointed at disastrous human-machine interface design.
The commission famously noted that the core problem wasn't that the operators were poorly trained in a general sense. The problem was that they were perfectly trained for a reality that simply did not match the one they found themselves in.
So the operators are cleared, the system itself is blamed. But think about what that does to the psychology of the general public.
It leaves a terrified community in an impossible position.
Huh.
I mean, you can't put a bad user interface in prison.
You can't put handcuffs on poor safety culture.
Exactly. When you don't have a single Dr. Evil to blame. Unlike the narrative we saw years later with Anatoly Dyatlov at Chernobyl, who was easily painted as the arrogant engineer pushing the system past its limits, you get what our sources call the pulverization of responsibility.
Responsibility pulverization is a fascinating and incredibly dangerous sociological phenomenon.
Let's unpack that. What does that look like in practice?
When a disaster is the result of 1,000 small systemic flaws rather than one giant human error, the blame is scattered like dust into the wind.
So the control room engineers blamed the management for tight budgets and understaffing.
The management blamed the operators for overriding the emergency pumps.
The operators blamed Babcock and Wilcox, the massive engineering firm that designed the reactor and the control panel.
And everyone involved blamed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, for having poor oversight and outdated regulatory frameworks.
It's a massive corporate circular firing squad.
And the public is watching this on the nightly news absolutely infuriated.
Right, because you have a situation where the governor of Pennsylvania is going on television recommending that pregnant women and preschool-age children within a 5-mile radius evacuate immediately.
That recommendation triggers a localized panic. An estimated 140,000 citizens voluntarily pack up their cars and flee their homes.
The highways are jammed. People are terrified of an invisible radioactive cloud or the potential of the hydrogen bubble inside the reactor suddenly exploding.
They are living a nightmare. And yet when the dust settles, no single person can be held legally accountable.
And when accountability is pulverized across an entire industry, it creates a massive vacuum of public trust.
The public felt completely betrayed by the technocratic elite. The myth of the infallible American engineer essentially died on the floor of the 3 Mile Island control room.
But, nature abhors a vacuum. And into that massive vacuum of trust, a couple of unlikely figures actually stepped forward to restore calm.
Their stories are crucial for anyone interested in crisis communication today.
Definitely. The first was a man named Harold Denton. He was a senior official from the NRC, and President Carter personally dispatched him to the site to be his representative.
Harold Denton became the face of reason for a terrified nation. At a time when the power company PR representatives were aggressively downplaying the crisis.
And looking like total liars.
Right. And the local politicians were clearly out of their depth and panicking. But Denton stood at the podium in front of the press corps and did something radically counterintuitive for a government official.
He was completely honest about what he didn't know.
He didn't sugarcoat the uncertainties. When a reporter asked him if the hydrogen bubble could explode, he didn't give a slick PR answer.
He explained the chemistry, explained the uncertainty, but communicated the facts clearly, calmly, and without defensiveness.
And then, of course, there was President Jimmy Carter himself.
Carter is a highly unique historical figure in this specific context. He wasn't just a politician trying to look tough for the cameras.
No, he had actual, legitimate, deep technical expertise. Before his political career, Carter served in the nuclear navy under the legendary Admiral Hyman Rickover.
He had literally studied reactor technology and worked on the dismantling of a damaged experimental reactor in Canada in the 1950s.
That background gave him an immense, unassailable amount of credibility.
So 4 days after the accident began, when public panic was at its absolute peak, President Carter flew to Pennsylvania.
And he didn't just give a speech at the airport. He walked directly into the control room of the damaged facility.
He wore those iconic yellow protective booties over his shoes. From a crisis communication standpoint, it was an absolute masterclass.
It's a remarkably powerful image. The President of the United States standing right there in the belly of the beast, looking at the same lying indicator panels the operators had looked at.
It sent an immediate, visceral, nonverbal signal to the terrified public, right?
Exactly. If the president is willing to physically stand in this room, the immediate danger of a massive apocalyptic explosion must be over. The government wouldn't risk the head of state if the facility was about to detonate.
It was exactly the reassurance the nation needed to start coming back home.
But despite Carter's visit, and despite the fact that the massive concrete containment building successfully held back the vast majority of the radiation, the psychological damage to the country was permanent.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable paradox regarding this whole event.
The Khomeini Commission, the NRC, and decades of subsequent independent epidemiological studies have all concluded the exact same thing.
The radioactive gases that were intentionally vented during the 3 Mile Island accident were so minimal and dispersed so widely by the wind that they caused 0 documented detectable health effects in the local population.
To reiterate, nobody died. Nobody was provably harmed by the radiation.
So I'm looking at this history, and the math just doesn't make sense to me. If no one is physically harmed, if the containment structure actually worked and protected the public from the melted core, why did this single event completely paralyze the American nuclear industry for the next 30 to 40 years?
Why did we stop building reactors?
Yeah, why?
To answer that, we have to transition away from the engineering of the nuclear reactor and look deeply into the engineering of the human brain. We have to examine the psychology of how we perceive risk.
Okay, let's get into the hard data on energy safety, which is heavily detailed in our source materials from places like Our World in Data.
It provides a staggering, almost unbelievable contrast to the public narrative.
Let's lay out those numbers for the listener, and we want to be very clear here. We are just impartially reporting the statistical data provided in the research. We aren't taking a political stance on energy policy. We just want to look at the raw epidemiological reality.
Right. The metric researchers use to compare energy sources is deaths per terawatt hour of energy produced.
And this is a comprehensive metric, right? It includes sudden accidents, mining fatalities, and long-term health effects from pollution.
Exactly. So let's start with the baseline. If you look at coal, the global average is roughly 25 deaths per terawatt hour.
25. And this staggering number is mostly due to the silent, continuous respiratory and cardiovascular damage caused by invisible air pollution.
Particulates, sulfur dioxide, heavy metals. Oil sits at about 18 deaths per terawatt hour. Natural gas is significantly cleaner, but still sits around 2.8 deaths per terawatt hour.
Okay. And then we look at nuclear power, including the massive tragic disasters of Chernobyl and Fukushima, including every single accident in the history of civilian nuclear power, sits at approximately 0.03 deaths per terawatt hour.
0.03. Statistically speaking, that makes it as safe as wind and solar power.
Let's contextualize that with a thought experiment based on the research to really make those numbers tangible for the listener.
Okay, imagine a hypothetical city of 150,000 people. If that entire city is powered purely by a coal plant, the statistical data suggests that 25 people in that city will die prematurely every single year from the resulting air pollution.
Year after year, 25 funerals.
Right. If that exact same city is powered purely by nuclear energy, statistically, one person would die every 33 years.
That is a mind-blowing discrepancy. It's a completely asymmetrical reality. So why are we so utterly terrified of the power source that kills one person every 3 decades? But we happily tolerate and even ignore the power source that kills 24 of our neighbors every single year.
Psychologists, particularly pioneer risk researchers like Paul Slovic, explain this cognitive dissonance through the framework of dread risk versus statistical risk.
Dread risk versus statistical risk.
Human beings are not perfectly rational calculating machines. We don't evaluate threats based on their statistical probability on a spreadsheet. We evaluate threats based on how they make us feel in our gut.
How does that framework define a dread risk? What triggers that deep, irrational fear?
Dread risk is triggered by threats that have very specific characteristics. They are usually invisible, highly complex, uncontrollable by the individual, and possess the potential for catastrophic, visually spectacular disasters.
Oh, I see. So coal kills millions of people, yes, but it does so quietly and continuously through asthma attacks and heart disease in hospital rooms.
Our brains process that as a background statistical risk. We normalize it as an accepted, mundane part of modern life.
But nuclear power checks every single box for dread risk. It relies on radiation, which is an infallible killer. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it.
The physics of atomic fission are completely opaque to the average person on the street.
And while accidents are incredibly rare, when they do happen, they threaten massive, sudden, apocalyptic devastation.
It's the exact same psychological mechanism that explains why people are terrified of flying in an airplane, but they will happily text on their phone while driving a car on the highway.
Oh, totally. You are statistically vastly more likely to die in a car crash, but you feel like you have control of the steering wheel.
Exactly. In a commercial plane, you are strapped into an aluminum tube at 30,000 feet, completely at the mercy of a hyper-complex system and a pilot you don't know. The lack of agency amplifies the dread.
And the irony of 3 Mile Island, when you apply this framework, is just profound. You had 140,000 people fleeing their homes in absolute terror, driving away from a radiation release that officially harmed no one.
Yet, at that exact same moment, nobody was evacuating away from the coal plants in Pennsylvania that were actively polluting the air, causing acid rain, and genuinely shortening the lives of the local population.
They were driving away from the statistical safety of the reactor right into the statistical danger of the highway and the fossil fuels.
It highlights a severe vulnerability in human cognition. And we really cannot talk about the psychology of the TMI panic without talking about the pop culture landscape at the exact moment the alarms went off.
Oh man, the timing is almost too bizarre to believe. Reality perfectly mirrored fiction.
You're referring to the movie?
The China Syndrome.
Yes. The China Syndrome. A massive Hollywood thriller starring Jane Fonda, Jack Lemmon, and Michael Douglas.
The plot is literally about a corrupt corporate management team trying to cover up a near meltdown at a nuclear power plant because of a faulty indicator gauge.
In the movie, a safety expert delivers a chilling line stating that a meltdown could render an area the size of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable.
The size of Pennsylvania. And that blockbuster movie premiered in theaters exactly 12 days before the feedwater pumps failed at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania.
12 days.
If you wrote that in a script, a producer would tell you it's too unrealistic. The public was already completely primed for a disaster.
The movie functioned as an educational primer in the worst possible way. It gave a terrified populace the exact vocabulary they needed to misunderstand the crisis.
When people heard terms like core damage or radiation leak on the evening news, their brains instantly mapped the real-world events to the Hollywood thriller they had just watched.
It functioned like pouring jet fuel on the fire of public panic.
It absolutely did, and it cemented a very specific cultural trope that has lasted for nearly half a century.
It solidified the image of the nuclear plant as a dark, unsafe, inherently dangerous place run by greedy executives who care only about money and incompetent, lazy workers who don't know what they're doing.
I mean, just look at the cultural impact of The Simpsons. It's the longest-running animated show in television history.
Right, Homer Simpson.
A lovable but dangerously incompetent buffoon who is literally the safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant, which is run by the evil, decrepit billionaire Mr. Burns.
That entire cultural caricature, which has been beamed into living rooms for decades, is a direct, lingering psychological scar from the spring of 1979. We use dark humor to process the lingering dread.
That is such a fascinating point.
Yeah.
But while our psychological inability to correctly perceive risk as a general public is dangerous, what our sociological sources point out is that it's infinitely more dangerous when the brilliant engineers who actually create these complex technologies suffer from their own institutional blind spots.
Because if we agree that the operators weren't ultimately the villains, and we agree that the public was spooked by an irrational psychological phenomenon amplified by a movie,
we still have to ask the fundamental question. What is the actual root cause of catastrophic failures in high-tech environments? Why do these massive systems fail in ways their creators never anticipated?
this brings us to the sociology of complex systems. Following the investigations into TMI, a prominent sociologist named Charles Perrow developed a highly influential concept which he called normal accident theory.
Normal accident. That sounds like a complete oxymoron. An accident is, by definition, supposed to be abnormal, right? It's a deviation from the norm.
You would think so. But Perrow looked deeply at the mechanics of 3 Mile Island and realized a terrifying truth about modern engineering.
Which is?
He argued that in systems that are both highly complex and tightly coupled, accidents aren't rare exceptions. They are the normal, expected functioning of the system over a long enough timeline.
Let's make sure we define tightly coupled for the listener, because it's a crucial concept for the rest of our deep dive. What does that actually mean in practice?
Tightly coupled means that a failure or a change in one specific part of a system instantly cascades to another part, without any buffer, slack, or time for a human being to intervene and stop the chain reaction.
Give me an example of that.
Think of it like driving on a highway covered in black ice with only 3 feet of distance between you and the car in front of you while everyone is going 70 miles an hour.
Okay, I'm stressed just picturing that.
Right. It doesn't matter how good your anti-lock brakes are. It doesn't matter how awake the drivers are. The system is moving too fast and the components are too close together.
So if one person simply taps their brakes,
A 50-car pileup is mathematically guaranteed to happen before human reaction time can even register the red brake lights. There is no slack in the system to absorb an anomaly.
So Perot is saying that if you build an industrial system that is sufficiently complex, with thousands of interdependent valves and pumps and tightly coupled, it doesn't matter how many redundant backup systems or safety protocols you have.
Given enough time, a catastrophic combination of minor unpredictable failures will interact in ways the designers never foresaw. It's mathematically inevitable.
The complexity of the system actually defeats the safeguards. You cannot engineer your way out of the problem simply by adding more complex safety systems.
Because those safety systems just add more interacting parts that can fail in unexpected ways.
Wow.
But there's another sociological concept at play here that makes tightly coupled systems even more dangerous. It was introduced by sociologist Diane Vaughan, and she calls it the normalization of deviance.
I found this specific part of the research to be the most chilling aspect of the entire TMI story. Because we desperately like to believe that before a massive disaster strikes, the universe gives no warning. It's a bolt from the blue. But there usually is a warning, isn't there?
Almost always. Massive systemic failures are rarely unannounced.
2 years before the 3 Mile Island core melted down, an engineer at Babcock and Wilcox, the massive engineering firm that designed the reactor and the control room layout, wrote a memo. His name was Burt Dunn.
And in this memo, Dunn predicted almost the exact precise scenario that would unfold at TMI-2.
He specifically warned his superiors about the PORV valve getting stuck open. He warned that the pressurizer would give misleading water level readings because of steam voids.
And he warned that this specific combination of events would severely confuse the operators, leading them to turn off the emergency cooling.
It was a modern-day Cassandra warning, absolute, perfect technical foresight.
He wrote it down. He documented the fatal flaw.
The memo was circulated, it's read by management, and it was completely, utterly ignored. No procedures were changed, no indicator lights were rewired, no operators were retrained.
And this is exactly where Diane Vaughan's concept of the normalization of deviance comes in.
Why did they ignore it?
It's very easy for us to look back at the managers who read that memo and say they ignored it out of greed or malice or sociopathic disregard for human life. But the reality of corporate sociology is much more subtle and, frankly, much more dangerous.
They ignored Burt Dunn's memo because nothing catastrophic had happened yet.
So the lack of a disaster is taken as proof of safety.
Exactly. In any massively complex organization, you have thousands of minor anomalies, glitches, and warning signs happening every single day.
If an anomaly happens, say a valve sticks for a minute but then closes, and no disaster follows, the organization gradually learns to accept that anomaly as a normal, acceptable operational risk.
The deviance from the ideal safety standard becomes normalized. Babcock and Wilcox had seen minor issues with these valves at other plants before, and none of those reactors had melted down.
So the institutional culture gradually shifted. They began to view Burt Dunn's urgent warning not as an existential threat to millions of people, but as an acceptable, manageable operational quirk.
It's exactly like driving your car with the check engine light glowing on the dashboard.
That's a perfect analogy. The first day it turns on, you are terrified the car is going to explode, and you plan to take it to the mechanic.
But if you drive it to work for a month and the car doesn't break down, you just accept the glowing yellow light as a permanent, harmless feature of your dashboard. You normalize the deviance.
Right up until the engine block cracks in half on the freeway.
3 Mile Island taught us that complex systems will inevitably fail. And when they do, they will generate a false reality that human operators fundamentally misunderstand.
And the human organizations that build and manage these systems are structurally, psychologically prone to ignoring the warning signs until it is too late.
So let's take a breath and pull back. We've spent the first half of this deep dive heavily unpacking the granular mechanics, the sociology and the psychology of a 47-year-old nuclear disaster.
Why are we talking about this today in 2026? How does this historical lesson apply to the modern world?
Because the answer to that question lies on the very same physical island in the Susquehanna River.
The physical geography of 3 Mile Island bridges the gap between the nuclear age of the 1970s and the artificial intelligence age of the 2020s in a way that is almost poetic in its irony.
It really is the ultimate historical irony. Let's bring the listener right back to the present day. What actually happened to the rest of the facility?
Well, TMI-2, the reactor that melted down, is basically a radioactive monument.
It's been sitting there for decades, undergoing a painfully slow, heavily regulated decommissioning process that won't be fully finished until at least 2052. It's a tomb.
But there was another reactor on that island, TMI-1.
Yes, TMI-1 was completely undamaged by the accident next door. And despite massive public protests, legal battles, and national media scrutiny, it was eventually restarted in 1985.
And here is the kicker. For decades, it operated incredibly safely and efficiently.
It produced massive amounts of stable, carbon-free power for the grid right up until 2019. And it wasn't shut down because of safety concerns or a mechanical flaw.
No, it was shut down purely for brutal economic reasons. It simply couldn't compete with the incredibly cheap natural gas that was flooding the American energy market from the fracking boom.
So in 2019, TMI-1 was officially disconnected from the grid. Everyone in the energy sector thought the era of nuclear power on 3 Mile Island was over forever.
But then the artificial intelligence revolution accelerated.
And in September of 2024, Constellation Energy, the massive utility company that owns TMI-1, dropped a bombshell announcement that completely shook the global energy markets.
They announced a $1.6 billion investment to wake the dormant reactor back up.
They are actively resurrecting 3 Mile Island. They are completely rebranding it naturally as the Christopher M. Crane Clean Energy Center, stripping away the infamous TMI name.
But the reason why they're spending over $1 billion to restart a 40-year-old nuclear plant is the most fascinating part of this whole story. It's because of
Microsoft. The explosive exponential growth of artificial intelligence, specifically the training and running of massive large language models and generative AI, requires an astronomical amount of electricity.
Data centers are no longer just server closets. They are power-hungry behemoths that require gigawatts of energy.
And Microsoft made a corporate commitment to run their operations on carbon-free energy. But they quickly realized that renewable sources like wind and solar are far too intermittent. The wind doesn't always blow, and the sun sets.
To run the AI revolution, to process trillions of parameters continuously, you need massive, uninterrupted baseload power, 247, regardless of the weather.
So to secure that power, Microsoft signed a binding 20-year agreement to buy every single watt of electricity that the resurrected TMI-1 reactor can possibly produce. They are buying the entire output of the plant.
The timeline is aggressive. Constellation Energy is aiming for technical readiness by 2027, though connecting it to the broader transmission grid might delay the actual power flow until 2031.
But just step back and marvel at the sheer literary irony of this situation.
It is profound.
The very site of America's greatest technological trauma, the ultimate terrifying symbol of the dangers of complex systems slipping out of human control, is being brought back to life to serve as the literal electrical engine for our newest, most complex, and potentially most dangerous technological arms race.
Artificial intelligence.
Which forces us to ask the crucial overarching question of this deep dive. As we use the site of our greatest systemic failure to power our newest complex system, have we actually learned the hard lessons of 1979?
Or are we repeating the exact same hubris, the exact same normalization of deviance as we race toward artificial general intelligence?
This is where the historical parallels get terrifying, because when you map the mechanical and human failures of the TMI control room onto the existential risks of modern AI development, they align perfectly.
Let's look at the first major parallel, the concept of the black box.
At 3 Mile Island, the human operators were fundamentally dealing with a physical black box. They were separated from the nuclear core by several feet of reinforced concrete and solid steel.
They could not look inside the vessel with their own eyes to see if there was water or steam. They could only see the inputs and the outputs displayed on a control panel.
They had to implicitly trust that the two-dimensional panel accurately reflected the incredibly complex three-dimensional internal logic of the core.
And when the panel lied, disaster struck because they had no way to verify the truth.
Today, right now, we are dealing with algorithmic black boxes that are arguably even more opaque than a nuclear reactor.
Deep neural networks, the underlying architecture behind massive models like GPT-4 or the systems being built by Anthropic and Google, are so phenomenally complex that they possess billions, sometimes trillions, of individual parameters.
And here is the scary part that a lot of people outside the tech industry don't realize. Even the brilliant engineers who built these models cannot always explain why the AI made a specific decision.
This is a well-documented crisis in the field of machine learning, known as the interpretability problem.
We know exactly what training data went into the system, and we can clearly see the text, the code, or the decision that comes out of the system.
But the internal mathematical pathways, the billions of weighted connections the neural network took to arrive at that specific output, are largely opaque to human understanding.
It's a literal black box. Just like the 1970s nuclear engineers who believed their elegant mathematical models guaranteed a perfectly safe reactor, today's tech leaders risk placing blind, unverified trust in AI systems simply because they appear incredibly capable, articulate, and intelligent.
Let's connect this back to that stuck-open PORV valve and the lying indicator light. When a modern AI system confidently gives you a completely false piece of information, a phenomenon the tech industry mildly calls a hallucination, it is the exact modern equivalent of that dark indicator light on the TMI control panel.
The interface is projecting a false reality.
Exactly. Imagine an AI integrated into a major hospital's diagnostic system. It scans a patient's chart and confidently tells a doctor, based on a completely hallucinated medical precedent, to administer a specific lethal dose of medication.
Or an AI legal assistant confidently invents a fake Supreme Court ruling to justify a massive corporate merger.
The interface is lying to the human operator with total, absolute statistical confidence. And if the human operator trusts the interface, just like Crank Faust and Ed Frederick trusted their pressurizer readings, the result is going to be catastrophic.
We are building systems that lie to us beautifully.
But here is where the metaphor escalates beyond a single hospital or a single control room, and where the stakes become genuinely existential for society.
Remember Charles Perrow's normal accident theory. He warned us about complex, tightly coupled systems.
3 Mile Island was tightly coupled, yes, the plumbing was interconnected, but it was ultimately a closed physical system. It was geographically isolated on an island in a river in Pennsylvania.
When the physics got completely out of hand, human beings still had the physical ability to intervene. It took them 2.5 hours of sheer panic, but they eventually figured out the valve was open, and they literally, manually pulled the plug by closing the block valve.
They could stop the machine with physical force.
Exactly. But AGI, artificial general intelligence, a system that can understand, learn, and apply knowledge across a wide range of tasks at or above human level by its very nature, will not be a geographically isolated system.
If we achieve AGI and we integrate it into our global financial markets to optimize trading, into our military defense networks to manage logistics, into our global supply chains, and into the very power grids that keep the lights on, it will have no physical boundaries. It will be omnipresent.
It will be the ultimate tightly coupled system, everything connected to everything else, constantly communicating and optimizing.
And because it is digital, a cascading failure in an integrated AGI system won't take 2.5 hours to unfold while operators scratch their heads. It will happen at the speed of light.
An algorithmic error or an unaligned goal in a high-frequency trading AGI could trigger a flash crash that wipes out the global economy in milliseconds.
The complexity and the sheer processing speed of the system will vastly, incomprehensibly outpace human cognition. We won't have the luxury of standing in a control room debating the meaning of a flashing light because the disaster will be over before our brains even register the alarm.
Which brings us back to that infuriating societal aftermath of TMI, the pulverization of responsibility. Remember how nobody went to jail? The Kameni Commission cleared the operators. The engineers pointed at management, management pointed at the regulators, and the blame was scattered into the wind. I want you to imagine responsibility pulverization 2.0 in the age of autonomous AI.
We are already starting to see the legal frameworks buckle under this exact issue.
Ask yourself, when an autonomous AGI-driven system managing a major city's traffic grid makes an optimization error, perhaps deciding that turning all the lights green is the most efficient way to clear traffic, and it causes a massive fatal pileup across 50 intersections, who is the villain? Who do the victims' families sue?
Is it the software engineer who wrote the base reinforcement learning code 5 years ago?
Is it the CEO of the tech company that sold the software to the city?
Is it the city official who signed the procurement contract without understanding the neural network?
Or is it the billions of unverified data points scraped from the internet that the AI trained itself on? It's completely impossible to point a finger. And just like the aftermath of 3 Mile Island, when nobody can be held accountable for a massive societal trauma, society's safety net and its trust in institutions rots away. If we deploy AGI without solving this fundamental accountability problem, the public trust won't just be damaged, it will completely evaporate. A society simply cannot function if it is entirely dependent on critical infrastructure systems for which no human being can be held legally, financially, or morally responsible.
And that profound lack of accountability leads us to the final and perhaps most heavily debated lesson we can pull from TMI, the alignment problem.
This is the buzzword of the decade in tech. How does a stuck steam valve in 1979 explain the alignment problem?
In modern AI safety research, the alignment problem asks a very simple but terrifying question. How do we ensure that a superintelligent AI's goals and optimization pathways are perfectly aligned with human values, human flourishing, and ultimate human survival? If you look back at 3 Mile Island, the system actually operated correctly according to its own internal physics. The mechanical valve got stuck open. Physics dictated that the boiling water would turn into steam, and that expanding steam would push the remaining liquid water up into the pressurizer. The reactor wasn't broken in its logic, it was just ruthlessly following the laws of thermodynamics.
The machine wasn't malicious, it wasn't trying to cause a meltdown.
No, it wasn't acting maliciously at all. But because the system's internal physical goal thermodynamics was misaligned with the operator's goal keeping the core cool, it resulted in a catastrophe. The danger of AGI isn't that it wakes up one day, becomes conscious, and decides to be evil like Skynet in the Terminator movies. That is Hollywood dread risk. The actual systemic risk is that we give an AGI a goal, for example, solve climate change or cure cancer, and it calculates that the most computationally or thermodynamically efficient way to achieve that goal is to eliminate the primary source of the problem. It might decide the most efficient way to cure cancer is to eliminate all biological hosts that can get cancer.
It's a completely rational mistake made by a hyper-complex system. It fulfills the goal perfectly, but in a way that destroys the user.
Exactly. TMI proved with devastating clarity that you cannot build the technology first, deploy it, and then think about the human-machine interaction and alignment later. If we transfer the incredible arrogance of the 1970s nuclear engineers, the firm belief that our math is perfect, therefore the system is inherently safe, to the modern development of AGI, we are playing with fire on a scale that dwarfs a single melting reactor core.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what is the ultimate synthesis we can draw from all these sources? The Kennedy Commission, the risk data, the modern AI developments. I think the true legacy of 3 Mile Island wasn't about the specific dangers of radiation or even the failure of a feedwater pump. It was a harsh, unforgiving lesson in human humility. It taught us that we have a persistent, dangerous habit of building systems whose complexity drastically outpaces our own ability to understand them in moments of crisis.
The lesson for the developers coding the future right now? Perhaps in a data center powered by the very reactor that survived that 1979 night, is abundantly clear. We cannot afford the technological hubris of the past. We must build AI systems that are transparent. We need systems that are interpretable where we can look inside the black box and understand the why. And most importantly, we need to build systems that are forgiving of human limitations. We need a radical commitment to safety culture, perhaps even an independent global oversight body for AI, similar to what the nuclear industry created with the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations after TMI.
We have to design systems that don't just work perfectly when the math is going right, but fail gracefully, slowly, and understandably when things inevitably go wrong. Because the stakes of a tightly coupled, unaligned AGI are simply too high for a normal accident.
They are existential.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something to keep in mind the next time you interact with a flawless, highly confident AI interface that gives you an answer you can't quite verify. 3 Mile Island taught us that the most dangerous moment in a complex system isn't necessarily when the machine violently breaks down in a shower of sparks. The most dangerous moment is when a system is actively failing, but the interface is quietly, confidently telling you that everything is perfectly fine. As we hand the keys of our global economy, our military defense, and our societal infrastructure over to artificial intelligence, how will we know if the indicator light is lying?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep questioning the interfaces around you.
We'll see you next time.